Devin, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing all right. I can't complain. Nobody will listen.
You and I were introduced by a mutual colleague, and you've heard me talk all the time about buyer personalization as the work
Mhm.
that we do, that all buyer buying ultimately is personal. People have to see something of value to them. And you've said, hey, that's great, Brent, but it's all well and good, but you can only do that if you have the right data and systems to understand intent, understand engagement and conversion. Great point. So I just thought today it'd be great for our audience to hear you unpack that a little bit
Sure.
more. So thank you for taking the time to join the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be here. Uh, I guess I'll just jump in on that real quick and point out that to me, it always starts with what are your highest level objectives and particularly driving, towards those business objectives. What is your revenue target for the business? And then how can we work backwards or drill down from there to effectively then be able to measure marketing's effectiveness in the world, whether that be buyer personalization and the touch points it has there, or whether it's awareness campaigns, demand gen, et cetera. There's a number of things where we need to be able to effectively look at data and help us answer questions that drive up towards that higher arching goal of how effective is marketing? How much revenue are we driving?
Yeah, I love the idea of a work back plan. I mean, on the sales side, we always same thing with sellers, like how much activity to get to how many first meetings to convert to second meeting, a proposal to close. So I love that work back plan. And you already mentioned some of the things we're going to talk about. What's the difference between if you're working on awareness, what does the data look like versus you're looking at demand gen, getting to quality first meetings versus full funnel. Before we jump into that, just for the audience as they think about, we got all of these systems out there now, in sales and marketing, in data. Well, for you, when you think about just the one-on-one of how people start to pull together the right data to build the model they need, what does that sound like?
Yeah, well, I think the first and highest priority for any company at this stage is having that clear central hub for all of your information. So that definitely sits on the shoulders of a CRM and by proxy marketing automation platform, often synonymous. The reason why is because that fundamentally any tool like Salesforce or HubSpot or potentially even Eloqua, others like that, they can all fundamentally carry that proper information about your customers, your potential customers, how you're interacting with them, what brought them to the website, what activities are bringing them to the site. There's a number of things that could absolutely be critical and central inside of that CRM. And so that's typically where it starts. We want to make sure if our home is not set up properly, then the rest of it doesn't necessarily really matter. But beyond that, I look at other platforms, like even ABM intent tools or anonymized analytics tools like Google Analytics 4, as an example, as other meaningful ways to be able to help support and drive towards the understanding of how marketing is doing overall. But it really, again, it starts at that CRM as kind of the hub of all of that central information. Then you can get more fun into like sales sequencing info, or sales sequencing and outreach platforms like Apollo or Zoom Info, and certainly even lead enrichment as well, being able to kind of improve the data that you're working with. But again, it all really centers on that square understanding of, how is my Salesforce or HubSpot or Eloqua data? Like, what is that telling me? And is it really helping report on our performance against these higher level metrics?
Yep. And you're kind of under positioning the value of what you and your team and others like you can do. trying Having
Thanks.
tried to wrestle with this a little bit across, website intent data and our own email sequences and our LinkedIn engagements.
The
It's a
whole thing.
pain. I just think we should be clear. I mean, there are like 7 or 8 different systems, right? You mentioned your CRM. Some people have a standalone marketing automation tool. You might have an intent tool. You might have sequencing software. You might have ad data, right? You might have
Oh yeah.
SEO data. You might have channel data. So let's not and I know you are really good at what you do and being humble, but I mean, to really get that view of personalization, you got to bring all of these things into, as you say, either a hub, either your CRM or your marketing automation tool.
Yep.
Um, so would love to just think about the CRM as you think. I don't know if there's anything more you can say. You in our pre-call, you said, how you would think about prioritizing those other systems probably varies on what business problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and I'm also a big proponent of trying to make sure that we can answer the goal as simply and as often cheaply as we possibly can. Oftentimes, it's not necessarily a tool problem, it is a usage problem. So, more so than anything else, especially when we come in and start working with clients, we take that analysis and try to understand where everything currently is within their existing tech stack before making recommendations around new stuff. And often, 99% of the time, everybody has a Google Analytics 4 account, which is great. And that gives us just enough information to be dangerous with as it relates to optimizing campaign performance, say for like advertising or search engine optimization. But when we start to actually really get deeper, if your house of cards, or excuse me, if your hub of all of your information, like your CRM, is not properly built out and has all of the right data in place, then that's where we need to really center our efforts before we start looking at other tools like an ABM or intent tool like Sixth Sense or Demand Base or any of those. It would be very difficult to try and bring in those tools without having your home hub really set up kind of properly first.
Well, this is a learning for me, so I want to make sure everybody hears it that Salesforce and HubSpot CRMs most people use can do a lot more on the analytics front than we give it credit. You need a partner who can build it out, but often people's first instinct is I got to go find another tool. So that was a key learning I want to just share. So let's say, in the pre-call, one of the things we talked about kind of three key use cases, and I mentioned at the outset, but let's just start with awareness, right? If
Yep.
your goal is to build market awareness, total volumes of impressions in your addressable market, we're going to use the CRM or a marketing automation tool as our hub. What become the key data and systems to kind of pull together now to build some visibility?
Yeah, the way that I like to think about this is, if you're looking at, the most fundamental data or levels of data, right? If we know that what we're trying to drive ultimately towards is these overarching goals of X amount of revenue or X amount of attributed sales volume from marketing campaigns, as an example, then we want to make sure that we're working backwards to try and answer, then the fundamental questions of how do we optimize, our strategies, our channels, our campaigns to make sure that we are hitting those fundamental objectives. And that does look different for every company. But to give a fictitious example, with a software company, that has, their model is primarily, one big enterprise license with maybe some user seat licenses, a value on that maybe $20,000 to $30,000 annually, so 30K ARR. We want to look at, certainly the number of impressions that a potential target account might have within an awareness campaign. And that fundamentally may not just come from, your Salesforce or HubSpot home hub per se. That may need to come from a secondary tool like, your Sixth Sense or your Demand Base or Rollworks. But ultimately, we know by just some of the existing data and establishing baselines that it may take a certain number of ad impressions at an awareness level to drive X amount of, demos, trials, on-demand demos, whatever your thing may be, to try and get people in conversation with sales. And then at that point, we know we would hopefully then have a baseline understanding of what a typical conversion rate is from a demo, trial, whatever it is, to a closed won conversion. And so now it just becomes a bit of a math game for us to fundamentally understand, okay, if we want to achieve X amount of closed won revenue, and we know it takes this many touches to equal out to this amount of closed won revenue, now we know how many impressions we fundamentally want to be able to drive against ideal target accounts. You have room to be able to create variances or modify things, as in we can improve, potentially the conversion rate from your trial, as an example, to close one revenue. But at the end of the day, what it's really coming down to is, are we getting the right impressions to ultimately kind of get people into the door and showing interest? And I think that's one where, again, that right tool and that right system in place will be able to fundamentally answer that for us.
Well, if you think about just the awareness, I'm guessing as a baseline, let's say your CRM is your hub, you probably need to add in your Google Analytics, as you said, and any SEO data that's coming out of that. But you also have an ad platform that might be serving up digital ads via whatever it is, G2 or competitive sites, or so is it is it feeding that data into just those couple of simple ones into your CRM at that point, or is it more complex than that, just at the awareness level?
Yeah, well, I think when you're thinking about that awareness level as a whole, often what could be challenging is that, we may only have data like impressions, clicks, CTR, and potentially, influence pipeline or influence booked meetings as a result of those campaigns. It's when you start looking at, the entirety of your marketing campaigns, as an example, through this funnel or through this kind of singular lens, or potentially multiple lenses, depending on how you want to break it out. That's when you really start to get a more holistic understanding. And I think, a challenge that companies can often have is they may see top line impressions, oh, we touched this account 10 times, or oh, we drove 1 million impressions at a 0.1% CTR. Woo-hoo, let's celebrate because we're above B2B benchmarks. Cool. But the challenge is, it's really, really then hard to take that and be able to say, then jump all the way to what was my influence close one revenue. I think a lot of cases we may never be able to fully get that answer. But what we can do is measure the changes in these metrics over time and then start to see influence. And so I don't think it's possible to necessarily say one ad impression from this campaign on this source drove, this inquiry on your site that then drove this close one revenue. I don't think we'll ever get to that place, given how much of a crackdown there is on cookies and kind of this cookieless future, attribution getting more challenging. But what I think we can do is start to measure over longer periods of time volume of ad impressions and changes in ad impressions, compared to then, as a baseline, changes in our booked meetings or trials or whatever it happens to be. And I think that's where really careful strategy and planning around your media mix in particular comes into play, where if the only influence that we change is a core message in an awareness campaign, and then we see changes in our number of booked meetings, we'll have to use those kind of almost with some form of a balance. I think we refer to that internally as the halo effect, because often we see that when you're running ad campaigns, as an example, and say even awareness campaigns, you often will see a direct increase in your overall branded search term volume to your website. But according to Google Search Console or Analytics or any of these other tools like SEMrush, they're just going to say, oh, you just had an increase in search volume for branded terms. We don't know where it came from. That's it. Like, that's what you're going to get. But to us, that's a halo effect. That's an indirect result of something else that you did that drove that type of brand, that type of brand reach. So for us, that, having baselines on essentially any marketing metric that may be feasible, and then tracking it over a period of time, will be the most helpful thing in terms of then trying to better answer, how much influence does this campaign have on this result. And I think that that's really where we kind of land, at least in terms of awareness.
So as we think about connecting the marketing, the awareness to then the sales side of the house, let's take that in two steps, and just to make sure I understand, kind of clarify what you were saying. You talked about the awareness lens first.
Yep.
Next is kind of the demand gen lens. How is that awareness and campaigning leading to quality meetings? And if I heard you correctly, what we need to do is baseline our engagement around awareness for a while, as while we're baselining first meeting production. And then I think what you're saying, and I'm putting my academic hat on as I heard it Rand all the time, is uh, correlation is not causation. But in the
Mhm.
world that we live in, the commercial world, like correlation is at least headed the right direction. So I think
Yep.
what you said is we're probably running tests by different channels or types of ads to see over a period of time as I'm running different tests, am I getting a spike in the number of first meetings? As of that halo effect is our best indicator that that's a good channel or a good ad or a good messaging frame. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, that's exactly right. And especially, when we start diving into then the demand gen side of the house, you know, a lot of the ad platforms in particular will make similar arguments around the number of impressions resulting in certain performance. The problem is we actually see that that's true. So while we try to take, as an example, what a Google or a LinkedIn may specifically say around a number of needing a certain number of impressions to then improve your demand gen metrics specifically, it is unfortunately true to some respect that we do see that. One good example I think that I'll leave for this group is in the B2B buying cycle on LinkedIn ads, they will often see that if you have at least, I think it's 17, maybe 20 impressions in an awareness campaign on a target account, they will then be more likely to download a piece of content from you if they've had that many impressions. And they say it's about a 1% bump in conversion rates on your demand gen campaigns as a result of your awareness campaigns. So I think that's a similar kind of or very specific tangential metric to what I was just referring to in the halo metric, or the halo effect, where we are literally saying, to some respect, the number of times that somebody sees your brand will then have that influence in terms of your demand gen performance. And so I think that then does play out when you start looking at what are your other campaigns that you're running in that kind of ultimate mix. Because it's very hard, I think, unless you are literally stealing demand capture, as it's called, is you're stealing demand from another tool or another kind of competitive resource to yourself, which is a very aggressive tactic to do. Um, Oftentimes we are trying to inform and kind of educate our potential buyers around making decisions. And so with that requires kind of having a nice balance in your awareness and your demand gen kind of strategy all the way around.
Helpful. Just on the, before we transition to full funnel, curious, like, as you think about, so you're looking for this halo effect, right? We're doing certain campaigns. What do you recommend? Like, hey, run 3 different LinkedIn ads at once and then
So
vary
you,
those over a month, or, mix a LinkedIn and a Google ad, or how do you help people think about, actually active and intentionally testing?
That's a great question. And I think it comes down to where you currently are in your marketing mix and your current kind of models of your campaigns. I think if you've never done something like this before, then certainly just establishing a baseline on one channel, I would say is probably the better outcome or the better thing to try first. Try that one channel strategy where, we're not confounding it across different channels because every channel is a little bit different, but then you are fundamentally, you know picking one variable and testing that in shorter cycles. So whether that be, you maybe try different ABM lists or target account lists that you're actively working on. If it's not one master, maybe it's, multiple tiers of lists as an example. So let's try different tiers with the same message and see what resonates first. Or let's try changing the messaging between a single campaign and see what happens there. Let's try a different offer and see what happens. There's so many different things that you could test out, um, that I think it's really important. And actually, one of the reasons why we ultimately developed what's called the sprint ad framework for optimization purposes, where it's fundamentally a very concise 14-day sprint trial where we were picking one variable, testing that for the time period, reporting on that, and then cycling that into, picking the winner and then using that as kind of the basis for the next experiment, and on and on and on it goes. So the whole intent of that framework is to fundamentally be able to answer, you know, what are the things that are going to help drive the most amount of impact, whether that be in an awareness campaign or demand gen, or even lower funnel conversion campaign. So I think the best answer to that question is try multiple things, just don't do it simultaneously. Be a good steward of data, and have your scientific testing theory hat on, only test one variable at a time and run that in an experiment and see what resonates.
Great. And you called it the sprint cycle method?
The sprint testing method is what we call it
Sprint
internally.
testing method. And so a sprint is basically 14 days where you're testing on one variable. Love it.
Yep.
That's easy to digest. So let's end on what you just referenced. As we think about now, we started with awareness, we moved on to demand gen, right? Driving, looking for the patterns for how do we get spikes in first meetings, running this sprint testing method. Does anything change as we look full cycle? I mean, in terms of the data we need to massage, or the data lens, or adding data, or different systems, what starts to change?
That's the beautiful part about this whole system, because that's when it goes back to the hub. And in these longer time periods, particularly quarters, half years, or full year cycles, that's when we really start to now fundamentally see what are the experiments, or what are the channels, or what are the campaigns that drove success, right? Because if we're all looking at the same metrics and we all can understand, if we're looking for booked meetings, as an example, we saw that X awareness campaign over a longish period of time didn't seem to have a ton of influence on this, but Y campaign did. Well, now we start to actually produce those better results, and then we can continuously kind of improve, iterate, and test on that model over time. So again, I think it all comes down to making sure that that hub clearly has that proper data aggregated that says, what are my objectives and how do these tie to your business goals? And then with that and the proper tracking of campaign and kind of marketing performance in place, that's when we can then start to answer those questions of, how much influence is this article, this type of article, as an example, on my blog, actually helping, drive business revenue or drive towards these specific metrics that are impactful for the business overall. So in the quarterly, half year and yearly terms, that's when we then start to do more granular look backs and tie campaign performance overall to the actual, potential meaningful KPIs that are important, like the booked meetings, the revenue influence, etc. And that's when we then start to be able to be more confident in terms of how we approach it. And I guess the final thing I'll add is that, not certainly not making excuses for anybody not being able to hit metrics, but I do think it's important to keep in mind, known variables or known influences in terms of what may affect your overall volume. As an example, seasonally, we all generally know, if you're in B2B software especially, November and December are kind of a crapshoot. Like, really, they could end up being a very, very slow time period, and that's a seasonal effect. I would not necessarily want to be launching huge, bold, brave campaigns during that time period. And I also wouldn't have overly high expectations unless it's a known season that you generally do successfully, like generally well. But I think it's important to keep those seasonality or other variables in mind. Even if, as an example, for higher education institutions, we know that, often the bulk of their kind of applications will happen in really the winter, springtime, right before they hit this deadline. And then it's pretty much cold, quiet for the summer, unless you're offering some kind of random fall program or late enrollment or something like that. So there's kind of known seasonality that needs to be kind of taken into account as far as those metrics at a higher level go. So I think that's why it's important, if you are doing benchmarking against yourself or against industry metrics, that you're taking those different seasons into account. And I don't think people need to overly complicate this. This can just be a matter of, oh, we're looking at the fall right now. We know compared to last fall, we're up. Great. Or, by comparison, if we're looking at a industry metric and we see, oh, we're a little bit down, but we know that this is a slow time for us. Cool. Not a problem. Let's keep moving. As long as everybody's generally aware of those things, I think people that pure focus on the cycle and of continuous improvement will ultimately help see people succeed. Whether it actually, in the immediate term drove that exact improvement or not, the process will ultimately help drive people in that direction.
Awesome. Devin, you clearly are a fountain of knowledge on this topic. I learned a ton in a very short period of time, so I appreciate it. I'm sure,
Awesome.
I don't know if you want to share your contact information, if anybody wants to reach out directly.
Sure. So again, it's Devin Littlefield and Market Vantage, and that is Market Vantage, not Advantage, just Vantage.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn, and it's just / Devin Littlefield on LinkedIn, Devin. I'm also email, of course, Devin@marketvantage.com.
Devin, thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brent. It was great to be here.